Cardinals, in my opinion, are one of the most beautiful bird species, and in today's video, I'm going to teach you how to paint your very own with acrylic. Before we can start our painting, first we need to get our sketch down onto our canvas. When it comes to sketching out your subject onto your surface, it really boils down to personal preference and how much work you want to put into your sketch before you begin to paint. The vast majority of my paintings, I normally start with the grid method. I find that it gives me the best foundation to work from, but still allows me a lot of flexibility to change things about the reference that may not suit my style. If you're unfamiliar with how to create a grid, I will leave a link in the description box as well as one of those info cards on the top right, so you can watch that video at your earliest convenience to learn how to create a grid. Now for this painting today, because it is on the smaller side, as well as for the sake of time in today's tutorial, I have opted to use tracing to get my outline onto my canvas as quickly as possible. What I'll do is I'll use a very light pencil to get a basic outline down, and then from there I'll use a much heavier, bolder pencil to add in all of the details over top using freehand. Now, there's a very negative outlook on tracing in the art world, and those artists who do trace may feel at times that they are cheating or that they are not real artists, and I'm here to tell you that is simply not true. There are a lot of benefits when it comes to tracing, such as speeding up our painting process, practicing and improving on our sketching skills, and even improving on our muscle memory as artists. As long as you are not directly copying over someone else's work, for example, a painting, a sketch, or using a photograph that you do not have permission to use, as long as you are not directly copying or tracing from their creative property, you are more than welcome, and I encourage you to use tracing as an educational learning tool. As a perfect example, I have offered this traceable and the reference to my members on Patreon, and I've sourced this reference to make sure it is copyright free, and both myself and our members, and now of course our YouTube community, have the option to use this reference without infringing on anyone's copyright. I encourage you to use whatever method you prefer to get this sketch onto your canvas, and remember, don't be shy if you want to try tracing, whether it's with my traceable or on your own for this painting or another one. Make sure you go ahead and try it. You are not a bad artist, you are not a fake artist, you are a learning one. Alright, so once you have your sketch complete, we can go ahead now and start to tone our background. So to start off, I'm using a large square brush, and I've completely loaded this square brush with burnt sienna and a lot of water to create this very thin, translucent watercolor type consistency. And I'm going to apply this paint mixture all over the surface of my canvas. Now, the purpose of this layer really is for two reasons. Number one, I find that it allows me to see the colors that I'm mixing much more clearly. For example, I can see my highlight colors and my shadow colors much more easily than I would if I were to paint them directly on the canvas. That middle tone level really helps us see our mixtures. And number two is that I also found that it kept my eyes much more awake and less tired and fatigued. Sometimes I'm in the studio for quite a long time, and staring at that very stark, bright white canvas really put a strain on my eyes. So by having this muted layer, it really did help keep the fatigue at bay. Alright, so once your canvas has completely dried, we can go ahead now and start to work on the background of our cardinal. The colors that I'm going to be using are phthalo blue, titanium white, and Mars black together, and I have a variety of different brushes ranging from a medium-sized filbert to a small round and even a blender brush. Now, I apologize for this first part. Unfortunately, my camera just decided to shut off the recording, so I did miss the mixture in the first top right-hand corner of this painting. However, to get caught up, you're just going to mix phthalo blue and titanium white together to create a very sort of middle tone 50% blue, and we're going to apply this all over the top right-hand corner of my canvas. This section of the painting, the top half, is going to be the lightest, and as I move around this background on my canvas, I'm going to adjust the color ever so slightly by adding in titanium white, or in some areas adding more phthalo blue, more Mars black to darken this color. And you're going to see here on my palette paper right now, I'm going to do just that by mixing a darker blue and using a wet on wet technique to blend those both together onto my canvas. Now, I personally love using wet on wet blending for my backgrounds, as I do find it gives me a very nice, smooth, subtle gradient and really kind of takes the work out of mixing my colors on my palette and allows me to break free a little bit and have a lot more fun. Now, if you're not familiar, wet on wet blending is when you have a wet color down on your canvas. So for example, my top right of the canvas with that 50% blue is still wet. And I'm coming in with a wet brush full of paint, but usually a different color, whether it's lighter or darker. And I'm going to mix those two together directly on my canvas. So rather than trying to mix them on my palette and bring them onto my canvas, I'm doing all of the work directly on my surface. While we are painting here, I did also want to mention something that is super important while painting your background, and it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the painting, and that is going to be to remember where your light source is and paint accordingly. So my light source for this cardinal painting is from the top down. So the top of my canvas is going to be the lightest blue possible. And as I slowly work my way down my canvas, that is going to get darker. And I'm going to reflect this in the painting of the cardinal and the branch as well. But I do like to start with this as a base and a reminder for me later on in the painting. Something that I did want to mention while I'm doing the voiceover for this tutorial is that I am covering over a lot of my sketch with this background color, as I didn't realize that those twigs and berries had a lot of tiny, minute spaces in between them that I would have to bring out a very, very small brush, and it would take quite a while to fill in the space. So I made a decision to just cover over this area with my background color and leave that large branch behind, but paint over all of the other elements. Now, I've been painting for a while, so I'm confident and comfortable doing this. However, if you are following this tutorial and you maybe are not as confident or just starting with acrylic, leave those twigs and berries in with your sketch, so just leave it alone and paint the background elements around it. It may take a little more time and a smaller brush, but if you want to leave that sketch in, you absolutely can. Now, this next section in the painting is my personal favorite, and that is going to be to use a blender brush and blend these layers together even further with a soft, gentle looking mist. Now, this is going to enhance your background, creating the effect that it is blurry and far away, allowing our subject to pop right off the canvas, but it's also going to allow any color changes or adjustments that may be needed. You will see in certain areas that I make the background much more dark towards the bottom and light at the top, and I really push this paint around to create a cloudy, misty effect. This is truly my go-to for creating fun, dynamic, yet realistic backgrounds for my paintings, and I encourage you at this stage just to experiment and have fun. Now, a little side note and tip as well, I use the blender brush for this section as it's a very dense, packed bristle brush that allows for a dry brushing, textured look and feel and creates this misty effect quite easily. So if you have not used a blender brush before, I definitely encourage you to try one. They have been a complete game changer, not only for backgrounds, but for a lot of other aspects in my painting like glazing. So I definitely encourage you to go out, see if you can find one. They are sometimes hard to find, but have really been a game changer for my work. All right, now a fun trick I learned recently to soften your layers in acrylic and remove some of those harsh edges is to use a white glaze over top of your completely dry layers. Now, it's very important that your acrylic so far is completely dry before completing this step. I'm going to water down my titanium white paint to a very thin watercolor type consistency. So you're going to use a lot of water, and I'm going to use a mop brush that is typically for watercolor application, and I'm going to swipe back and forth across my canvas to create a very thin film of paint on top. Now, this is going to soften some of those harsh edges that your filberts or your square brushes can achieve, and it's going to, in my opinion, blend this background even further. Once that has completely dried, and it will dry very translucent and not as opaque as it initially looks, I'm going to start working in the bokeh dots for my background. And this will give the look of lens flares or snow in this cardinal painting. The trick for creating bokeh, in my opinion, is to use a Q-tip, just a regular household beauty Q-tip. I have tried many different methods, 1,000 different paintbrushes, and each time I end up coming back to my trusty Q-tip. In order to create these dots, I'm going to water down my acrylic to a watercolor type consistency, and I'm going to wet the end of the Q-tip as well. I'm going to dive into light blue, white, darker blue, all around my canvas and create different sized dots randomly throughout. This is where you can really let go and experiment and create as many dots or as little dots as you prefer. Something that I wanted to talk about and mention that I think is super important for the bokeh effect is to use varying amounts of water in your color mixtures to create different visibility spots for your background. Now, what I mean by that is play around with the amount of water. For example, less water means that your paint is going to be more opaque in your background, and that is going to create brighter, more visible dots. And this gives the illusion of closeness to our viewers. So those are going to seem much closer to our viewer looking at our painting than, let's say, if we had a very thin, watered down paint that applies really quite translucent. Those are going to look further away for our viewer. So we want a little bit of both. We want opaque dots, but we also want to have those really faint, farther away ones to give the illusion of that bokeh. If they're all one opacity, it's going to look almost like polka dots rather than that lens flare or snow falling. Once that has dried, I'm going to use my Molotow acrylic pump marker in white to add in specks of snow that are going to be the brightest element in our background. So these are going to be the closest snowdrops that we can see as a viewer. Depending on how much snow you want in your painting, whether it's a blizzard or a light flurry, you're going to add either a lot of dots sporadically throughout, or even just a little to create a light snow effect. Before I start adding in the red paint to our cardinal, I want to paint in the areas of black first. This is going to give me a roadmap for the anatomy of the cardinal. In case I happen to get a little messy with my paint, I can see the black markings underneath and where they are located, and I can fix any overlap or mistakes that I might make during the painting process. I'm using one of the smallest brushes that I have available, the 000 round, and Mars Black straight out of the tube to create these markings. Once that has dried, I'm going to go ahead and finish off the eye of this cardinal with some light gray and blue highlights. Because this eye is pretty small in relation to the rest of the painting, it does not need as much detail and can be finished now with just a few easy steps. Now we are getting into the fun part of this painting, and that is going to be to start painting the bird itself. So to begin, I'm going to start with a base layer of red-orange on the beak. I have mixed in red, yellow, and titanium white together, and I'm using a small round brush, and I'm going to paint this entire beak top and bottom with this color mixture. While that beak area is drying, we can go ahead now and start with our base layer for our cardinal's head. In order for our red to be as bright and vibrant as possible, I need to start with white as my base. This is going to allow my paint to apply much more smoothly and have the most pigment possible when it dries. If I were to paint this red on our blue background without our white layer, some of that blue background may shine through underneath our red when it dries and really dull out that color. You may also have to use 3 or 4 different layers to achieve the brightness that we're looking for, and quite frankly, I'm just trying to save paint and save some time. Now, different brands of acrylic are going to dry differently depending on their formula and the grade of your acrylic paint, and some colors are just notoriously more translucent than others. So if you are looking for the most saturated color pigment possible for this cardinal and all of your other paintings, always begin with a layer of white and then layer on that color over top. While that white base is drying, I'm going to go ahead and add in details to our cardinal's beak. I'm going to do a darker shadow color of red and black mixed together to create the roundness and the fullness of the beak shape that I am looking for. And then I'm going to add in over top a very soft gradient of yellow and pink for the beak's highlight. Now, beaks vary in their design and color and by species, so be sure to follow your reference or have fun designing your own. Sometimes it's fun just to wing it, no pun intended, and just create what your heart is feeling. Now, this was all completed in my smallest round brush, including the slight line of dark red to indicate the beak's 2 halves. So I am using my 000 round and all of those different color combinations, some wet on wet blending, to create the look and feel that I'm going for. Now here's where you're going to see the magic happen with our preliminary white base layer. I'm going to take my cadmium red and my round brush, and I'm going to apply it directly over top of my white layer. I haven't done any mixing prior to this, and I'm using the paint straight out of the tube, and you can see the exceptional coverage and pigment of this red layer come to life. It truly has been a game changer for me and my painting journey, and I really hope it is for you as well. Now, in the spirit of productivity in all of my tutorials, I'm going to continue working on my base layers of my cardinal by adding in a darker red to the wings, which is red and Mars black mixed together. And I'm also going to start working on the white base layer process for the belly of this beautiful bird. Once you have that step completed, we are going to go ahead and work on the detailing of this cardinal's head. Now, typically with most of my paintings, I will work from dark to light. So I'm going to start with a dark red first for the shadows, and these are going to be the shadows in the furthest away area within the feathers. And I'm going to use a lighter pink tone to create the highlights. The best part about using acrylic is that you can layer as many times as you wish, pretty quickly, to achieve the desired outcome that you're looking for. So if you feel as though you don't have enough shadow or highlight, you can always continue to add layers until it looks good and accurate to your vision. Now, don't be afraid to come in and use some of that bright red on top as well if you feel as though your cardinal has become too pink or too dark. In some areas, I felt as though my cardinal was becoming a little bit too pink on the highlighted side, and I decided to bring back some of that red around the cheek and the beak area to just brighten it up a little bit and bring back some of that saturation. All right, so just as we did with the cardinal's head, we're going to repeat these exact same steps with the body. First, we are going to start with a basic plain layer of cadmium red on the chest and the belly area of the cardinal, and then we are going to follow it up with our shadows and our highlights. For me personally, this is where you start to see the painting come to life and really begin building the look and the feel of the painting. I remember feeling quite excited to hit this stage as the cardinal was beginning to jump off the canvas with that bold, beautiful bright red and not look so flat and boring. It was really starting to take shape. Now, when it comes to detailing your cardinal, I am using a very small round brush and I'm adding in tiny brush strokes where I see any darkness or lightness in the feathers. Because of the size of this painting and the brush that I'm using, these tiny paint strokes are just enough to create the look that there are feathers there and that this bird has texture. I don't need to get too detailed and paint in every single feather that I can see. Only focus on the general idea as this bird is pretty far from us and on a smaller canvas, so we're just going to focus on the general idea of the texture. We don't need a lot of heavy detail, and in my opinion, for this size painting and our subject matter, sometimes less is more. The next step in our painting is to create the wing on the side of our cardinal. I like to start off with the shadow details first. As you know, I work from dark to light, but I also want to start blocking in some of the feather details and their texture. For the wing, I have opted to add in a bit more detail with these U-shaped brushstrokes, which to me indicate longer and larger feathers on the top portion of the wing, as well as these longer fine lines down towards the bottom. This is probably going to be the most finicky and detailed section of our painting and can be at times a little bit confusing. I know there's a lot going on with the many different directions of the feathers, maybe their color and or their pattern. Take your time through this and create ultimately what your heart desires. I have finally learned after many years of painting that I don't need everything to be perfect or as the reference depicts. Sometimes I can improvise my details in my painting and make it my own, and that's okay. So if your feathers aren't perfect, you have one too many or one too few, that's okay. It's very unlikely anyone's going to notice, and it can actually create some fun, unique nuances in your painting that differ from your reference and make it your own. Next, I'd like to work on the bottom half of this cardinal and get it finished. I will be working on the tail and the bottom section of the wing by adding in my shadows and my highlight details. Typically, these sections on birds are much longer than their top half counterparts and are going to use longer brushstrokes to create the appearance of those long, thin feathers. Now, this is also where that initial black outline comes in handy, as I'm able to see the position of these feathers through my red paint, and I can paint the details in following this outline. I will be using the same red shadow color, that is cadmium red and black mixed together, for those darker areas, and I'm going to use red and white together to create those pinky highlights. I found personally that my round brush or my liner brush worked perfectly for this section, but feel free to use whatever brush allows you to create those finer details. Once that has dried, we are going to tackle the feet. Now, this color is a mixture of burnt umber, cadmium red, and white mixed together, and I'm going to mix 3 variations of this color on my palette before I begin. One that is going to be darker for the shadows, and this color mixture is also going to have a bit of Mars black. One that is a base color layer, which covers the entire foot, and one that is lighter, with a lot more titanium white in it for the highlight. That way I can bounce back and forth between these 3 colors simultaneously. They're already pre-made, ready to go on my palette, and they're going to have the same appearance. They're going to be in the same color family. Sometimes when we remix colors or make them separately at different times, we forget the exact color mixture and they just tend to vary. So I found this to be the easiest way. Now, the easiest way to paint in these feet is to go ahead and cover the entire surface with the base layer of our brown. So the brown that is right in the middle, 50%, not too dark, not too light. Once that has dried, we can go ahead and draw in the outline of these little feet with our darker color, which primarily is going to be between the toes and the back claw. The highlights are going to act as the details in this section of the painting and are going to indicate all of our texture on this foot. You're going to see here that I selectively place this lighter color to show the scaly, rough texture of our bird's feet and leave some of the shadow and base layer to shine through. So we don't want to cover over all of our hard work so far layering. We want to make sure we have some of that shadow and that base left behind to really create a nice 3D looking foot. Now that our cardinal is complete, we can go ahead and start to work on the branches of our painting. Now, depending on your sketch, this may vary, and especially if you've decided to keep your sketch intact and not cover over it as I did, you may have to skip a step or two. Now, I'm going to use burnt umber, burnt sienna, and white together to create this very lovely medium brown. I'm going to cover over the entirety of this branch and start to add in these smaller twigs extending from the main branch as well. You can add as many or as few twigs as you'd like. Just keep in mind the shape and the size of your canvas and how crowded or bare you would like it to be. I like to have a happy medium and just enough twigs to add on our berries later on. When that area has completely dried, we're going to go ahead now and start adding the texture to our tree branch. I like to start with the shadows, so I'm going to make a darker brown using burnt umber and burnt sienna together, and I'm going to apply that wherever I can see the dark parts of tree bark in my reference. I like to make my trees a little more painterly, so I'm going to add in some fun and unique lines and brushstrokes to create a more stylized version of the tree, but you can paint it however you like. I'm going to add in my shadows, and then I'm going to come in over top with my highlights. Now, the highlight color for this section is going to be burnt umber, burnt sienna, titanium white, and some cadmium yellow together to create this very warm yellow-brown. Just as I did with the shadows and texture, I'm going to apply the same technique but to the highlights and the light source on this tree. Now I'm going to find all of the light areas of the branch within my reference, and I'm going to apply this gorgeous yellow and continue building that texture. You will see that just these 3 layers alone can create such a beautiful tree with a lot of detail, even for a smaller painting. After the branches have been painted, we can go ahead and add in the berries. Now, the first step is to go ahead and block in the shape of the berries and their position on the branches using white paint. I like to use white paint as a base because it allows the red to be applied smoothly, just as we did with the cardinal, but I also find it easier and less stressful to use. If we make a mistake, it is much easier to cover over white than it is red on that blue background, and we could even turn it into a bokeh effect if we didn't like the shape or the size of our berries. It's a win-win and kind of allows us to pivot if we don't really like how it's looking. We could just turn it into something else. Now, you can use a Q-tip for this section to get a nice smooth round shape, or your small fine brush, whatever you prefer, and makes creating these circles easier. Once that base has dried, we are going to apply 3 different colors to these white bases to create beautiful, round, eye-catching berries. Now, first we are going to start with cadmium red as our foundation, and we're going to apply it all over the entirety of these shapes. We are essentially using the same techniques as our cardinal, but we're going to apply it to a much smaller area. Once you've applied the red base, we're going to add some shadow detail using our darker red mixture, which is made up of cadmium red and Mars black together, to create the roundness of the berry we are looking for. I like to apply this shadow in a U-type shape along the bottom to create the depth and the illusion of being round. Once that has dried, I will then apply a highlight on the top portion of the berry using my pink highlight of cadmium red and white together to create this pop of dimension. These are just a few simple steps, but really do create some beautiful assets for our painting that really tie in the red of our cardinal to this branch. The last final step for our painting is to go ahead and add in some more snow texture. We want this piece to look cohesive, and by adding in some snow on top of our bird and branch with berries, it is going to bring the piece all together. If the snow was just in the background, it wouldn't necessarily look realistic. Something would look as though it was missing, so we want to be sure to have some of those snowflakes on top of our bird to wrap this painting up and to keep it consistent. I am using my Molotow acrylic pump marker, but you can use a small paintbrush with white paint, whatever you prefer and have available. Alright, and there you have it. There is our finished cardinal painting. I have titled this one The Messenger. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and a comment letting me know your favorite part of this tutorial and which tutorial you'd like to see next. Of course, a big shout out to our Patreon members. Thank you so much for your support as always. And if you'd like to become a member of our Patreon, all the information can be found in the description box below. And as always, a big shout out to our channel sponsors, Chartpak, Grumbacker, and Molotow. Thank you so much for your support as always. You can find their information in the box below, as well as a special coupon code that you can use to save 15% on an order of $20 or more. Now, if you'd like to catch another acrylic tutorial, you're not done painting yet, go ahead and watch this video.